The Isles of Scilly. This small archipelago lies off the southwestern tip of England and would be lost to relative obscurity if not for the islands being involved in a direct war with the Netherlands. And not only was this war rather comical and absurd, it also ranks as the longest individual conflict in all of human history, only surpassed by compounded wars such as the Reconquista or Crusades. And what's even more remarkable is that this happened without a single drop of blood being spilled. Indeed, the Dutch Scilly War, also known as the 335-year War, lasted from 1651 to 1986, and is an extraordinary story of civil war, betrayal, and the often confused nature of historical international diplomacy. The origins of this extended war date back to the late 1640s in the heat of the English Civil Wars, where the Dutch, an unlikely player in this domestic clash, had decided to join the conflict on the side of the parliamentarians after identifying them as the most likely victors. The Royalists, who had been a long-time ally of the Dutch and assisted the country in many of their struggles, such as the 80 Years' War, saw this as a betrayal and so set about taking their revenge, raiding Dutch shipping lanes in the English Channel. And there wasn't much the Dutch could do at this point, as the Royal Navy was still the most powerful force on the seas. But by 1651 the tide had turned against the Royalist forces on land, and they were driven back to their last stronghold of Cornwall by Cromwell's parliamentarian forces, with the Royalist navy forced back to the tiny Isles of Scilly. The Dutch, seeing an opportunity to recoup some of their losses from the Royalist raids, immediately sent a fleet of 12 warships to the Isles of Scilly to demand reparations. According to the memorials of English writer Bulstrode Whitlock, after receiving no satisfactory answer from the Royalists, the Dutch Admiral Martin Tromp subsequently declared war on the Isles of Scilly from the 30th of March 1651. Note that this wasn't a war against England, just the islands themselves. Interestingly, there are conflicting accounts over whether or not Tromp actually had the authority to declare war on the Isles of Scilly. Some argue that he had been given the authority prior to setting out, whilst others argue that he carried out a blockade of the islands whilst waiting for his government's approval. Regardless of the specifics, 3 months later in June 1651, Cromwell's forces under the command of Admiral Robert Blake forced the Royalist fleet to surrender, and the Isles of Scilly reverted to parliamentarian control. So, as the Royalist forces were no longer able to pay them reparations, what did this massive Dutch fleet that was surrounding the islands do? Did they bombard the islands with their massive cannons, or did they send the Marines in to annex the territory? Well, no, they just instead went home. They were, of course, already allied with the parliamentarians, and so as to not cause any more conflict with Cromwell's England, they just left back to the Netherlands, albeit forgetting one key thing. For whatever reason, most likely due to the obscurity of the declaration of war by Tromp itself, they had never actually signed a peace treaty with the Isles of Scilly, technically leaving the two sides under a constant state of war for the next 3 centuries. Fast forward to 1985, when a local historian and chairman of the Isles of Scilly Council, Roy Duncan, wrote to the Dutch embassy in London to see if there was any evidence to support the seemingly absurd claim of a 335-year war, which had become somewhat of a local legend on the islands. To everyone's surprise, the embassy uncovered a series of documents which suggested that yes, indeed, the Netherlands and the Isles of Scilly were still at war. Likely somewhat bemused, Duncan hastily wrote to the Dutch ambassador Rijn Huidekoper, inviting him to visit the islands and to sign a peace treaty officially. Huidekoper agreed, and on the 17th of April 1986, a peace treaty was signed between the Isles of Scilly and the Kingdom of the Netherlands. The Dutch ambassador even later joked that it must have been a horrifying experience for the Isles of Scilly to know that they could have been attacked at any moment. And with that, the longest war in history came to an end, a completely bloodless conflict that had been lost to history as just another myth originating with the English Civil Wars. Now, though, it goes down as one of the more comical events to occur throughout military history, and although the war's authenticity has been questioned by some, because neither side that took part in the war was sovereign, Admiral Tromp was obviously an admiral and he wasn't the nation of the Netherlands, and the Isles of Scilly were just part of England, but it is nonetheless a legendary tale for the annals of history. As always, thank you very much for watching, please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.